In the summer of 1933, a group of Wall Street bankers secretly approached the most decorated Marine in American history with a terrifying offer. They didn't want him to run for office. They wanted him to lead an army. They had raised $3 million to hire 500,000 desperate World War I veterans. Their plan was to march on Washington, D.C., force President Franklin D. Roosevelt to resign at gunpoint, and install a fascist dictator to run the United States. This wasn't a fictional movie plot. It was a real conspiracy testified to under oath in Congress. But the bankers made one fatal mistake. They thought General Smedley Butler was corrupt enough to take the money. They didn't realize they were handing the evidence to the one man brave enough to stop them. This is the story of the business plot, the closest America ever came to a military dictatorship. This story reveals how close democracy came to dying in a backroom deal. Chapter 1. The conspiracy began on a hot, humid Sunday afternoon in July 1933. The location was Newton Square, Pennsylvania, a quiet rural town far away from the skyscrapers of New York City. General Smedley Butler was sitting on the porch of his farmhouse. He was retired, wearing old clothes, looking like a simple grandfather, but his eyes were watching a strange car coming up his driveway. It was a black, chauffeur-driven limousine. In the middle of the Great Depression, when most Americans were starving, a car like that was a rolling symbol of immense wealth. Two men stepped out of the back seat. They were dressed in expensive tailored suits that looked out of place in the country dust. One was named Bill Doyle. The other was Gerald McCoy. They introduced themselves as bond salesmen from Wall Street. They worked for a prominent investment firm, but they weren't there to sell stocks. They walked up the porch steps and sat down with the general. They didn't waste time with small talk. They told Butler that the American Legion, the largest organization of veterans in the country, was broken. They claimed the current leadership was failing the soldiers. They said they wanted to fix it. McCoy opened his briefcase. He told Butler that they represented a group of concerned businessmen who wanted to see a change in leadership at the upcoming American Legion convention. They wanted Butler to attend the convention and deliver a specific speech. They handed him a draft of the speech. It was written for him. Butler looked at the papers. Then he looked at the men. He asked the obvious question: who is paying for all this? McCoy smiled and dropped the first hint of the enormous power behind him. He told Butler not to worry about the cost. He opened his jacket and revealed a thick roll of cash. He said they had plenty of money. He said there were millions available to make sure the veterans did exactly what the businessmen wanted. Smedley Butler sat back in his chair. He was a man who had spent 33 years in the Marine Corps. He knew what a bribe looked like. These men weren't asking him to give a speech. They were buying his reputation. They wanted to use his face to control a million angry soldiers. Most men would have kicked them off the porch. But Butler did something smarter. He smiled, leaned forward, and pretended to be interested. He wanted to know exactly who was sitting in the back of that limousine. The conversation on the porch shifted quickly from friendly to dangerous. Smedley Butler played the part of the greedy soldier. He told McCoy that traveling to the convention in Chicago would be expensive. He said he couldn't afford the train tickets or the hotel. McCoy didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a bank deposit book. He flipped it open and showed it to the general. Butler looked at the numbers. It showed a fresh deposit of $42,000. In 1933, during the worst days of the Depression, that was a fortune. It was more money than most Americans would see in a lifetime. McCoy said this was just petty cash to cover expenses. He told Butler that there was plenty more where that came from. He dropped names of the backersmen connected to the biggest banks in New York, including JP Morgan and Co. Butler realized the scale of what was happening. These weren't just salesmen. They were bagmen for the American elite. But he needed to know why. Why were the richest men in America suddenly interested in a veterans club? McCoy leaned in and lowered his voice. He explained that the concerned citizens he worked for were terrified. President Roosevelt had just taken office, and he was threatening to take the dollar off the gold standard. To a normal person, this sounded like boring economics. But to the bankers holding millions of dollars in gold-backed bonds, it was a catastrophe. It meant their wealth would shrink overnight. They believed Roosevelt was destroying the country. They believed he was a socialist traitor to his class. They needed a weapon to fight back. They realized that the only group powerful enough to scare the president was the American Legion, the army of veterans. If they could control the Legion, they could control the government. McCoy told Butler that they didn't just want a speech. They wanted a revolution within the organization. They wanted the rank-and-file soldiers to turn against the current government. They needed a leader the soldiers loved, a hero they would follow into hell. They needed Smedley Butler. As the limousine finally drove away down the dust road, Butler stood on his porch, holding the bribe in his mind. He was disgusted. He had spent his life fighting for the American flag, and now these men wanted to buy it. He could have called the police right then. But he knew that if he reported them now, it would be his word against the richest men in America. No one would believe him. He needed proof. He decided he would have to do the one thing he hated most. He would have to pretend to be a traitor. Chapter 2. To understand the colossal mistake the bankers made, you have to understand the man they were trying to buy. Smedley Darlington Butler was not a politician in a suit. He was a warrior carved out of scar tissue and granite. By 1933, he was a living legend. He was one of only 19 men in American history to be awarded the Medal of Honor twice. He had a tattoo of the Marine Corps globe, an anchor across his chest. His men called him Old Gimlet Eye because of his fierce, piercing stare that terrified recruits and generals alike. Butler had spent 33 years fighting in the mud and jungles of the Philippines, China, Nicaragua, and Haiti. He was a Mustang, an officer who had started at the bottom and fought his way up. He didn't sit in a command tent. He led charges from the front. The veterans of World War I didn't just respect him, they worshipped him. To the millions of poor, unemployed soldiers camped out in America's parks, Smedley Butler was the only officer who actually gave a damn about them. This celebrity is exactly why the Wall Street plotters targeted him. They didn't care about his medals. They cared about his influence. They knew that if Smedley Butler got on a white horse and told the veterans to march on the White House, 1,000,000 men would follow him without asking questions. The bankers looked at Butler's resume and saw a thug. They saw a man who had spent his career invading foreign countries to protect American business interests. They assumed he was a mercenary. They thought that because he had killed for the United States government, he would be willing to kill the government itself for the right price. But they missed one crucial detail. Smedley Butler was experiencing a crisis of conscience. He was beginning to look back on his career with disgust. He was starting to realize that for 30 years, he hadn't been a hero for democracy. He had been, in his own words, a high-class muscle man for big business. The bankers walked onto his porch, thinking they were hiring a gangster. They didn't realize they were talking to a man who was desperately looking for a way to wash the blood off his hands. The bankers made a fatal miscalculation because they didn't read Smedley Butler's recent speeches. After retiring, Butler had undergone a radical transformation. He stopped sounding like a general and started sounding like a whistleblower. He looked back at the wars he had fought in Haiti, Nicaragua, and Mexico, and he realized a sickly truth. He hadn't been fighting to protect the American people. He had been fighting to make the Caribbean safe for the profits of banks like National City Bank and Brown Brothers Harriman. He famously declared, "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscleman for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." He realized that war was not about glory. It was a racket. It was a machine where millions of poor men died so that a few rich men could become millionaires. He was disgusted by the very system the plotters represented. So, when Gerald McGuire sat on his porch offering him thousands of dollars, Butler didn't see a golden opportunity. He saw the enemy. He saw the same men who had sent his Marines to die in the jungle just to secure a sugar plantation or a bank loan. This hatred made him the perfect spy. He didn't need to learn how to act. He knew exactly how these men thought. He knew they viewed him as a dumb soldier who could be bought. He decided to lean into that stereotype. He decided to play the part of the greedy, disgruntled general perfectly. He would let them think they owned him right up until the moment he put them in handcuffs. The trap was set, but before he could spring it, he needed to understand exactly what had terrified these billionaires so much that they were willing to commit treason. The motive for the coup wasn't political, it was personal. To understand the rage of the plotters, you have to look at the day their fortunes vanished. In March 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office. The United States was in freefall. Banks were locking their doors, factories were silent, and the streets were filled with hungry men. Roosevelt decided that to save the country, he had to break the rules. For a century, the American dollar was tied to gold. This system, known as the gold standard, was the foundation of Wall Street's wealth. The richest families in America, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers held millions of dollars in government bonds. These bonds were a promise. The government would pay them back in solid gold. But in April 1933, FDR dropped a nuclear bomb on the financial system. He signed Executive Order 6102. It was a shocking decree. It made it illegal for private citizens to hoard gold coins or bullion. It ordered everyone to turn their gold into the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper money. Then, FDR devalued the dollar. In the blink of an eye, the value of the paper money dropped. This was great for a farmer in debt because it made his debt easier to pay. But for the bankers holding the bonds, it was a catastrophe. Since the dollar was worth less, their gold bonds were now worth 40% less. The bankers looked at their ledgers and saw millions of dollars evaporating. They didn't see this as economic policy. They saw it as armed robbery. They believed that the President of the United States had just stolen 40% of their net worth to buy popularity with the poor. The panic on Wall Street turned instantly into rage. In the exclusive dining rooms of the Union League Club and the Knickerbocker Club, the titans of American industry gathered to discuss what had just happened. These were men who controlled the steel mills, the railroads, and the chemical factories. They were used to the government serving them, not robbing them. They felt a deep, personal betrayal. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't a communist revolutionary from the streets. He was a Roosevelt. He came from old money. He had gone to Harvard. He was one of them. To the bankers, his decision to abandon gold wasn't just bad politics. It was treason against his own class. The mood in New York shifted from shock to war. The bankers believed that the gold standard was the only thing stopping the United States from becoming the Soviet Union. They looked at FDR's New Deal programs, paying people to dig ditches, regulating banks, supporting unions, and they saw the end of capitalism. They did the math. The next presidential election wasn't until 1936. That was 3 long years away. If FDR continued at this speed, they believed there would be no wealth left to protect by the time the voters went back to the polls. They realized that the democratic process was too slow to save their fortunes. They couldn't bribe Congress to stop him. FDR was too popular. They couldn't sue him. He controlled the courts. They needed a solution that operated outside the law. In the smoky back rooms, the conversation shifted from economics to regime change. They looked at what was happening in Europe. In Germany and Italy, strong leaders were taking control, crushing labor unions, and protecting industrial profits. The bankers began to whisper that perhaps American democracy was an outdated luxury. Perhaps the country needed a manager who wasn't afraid to break the Constitution to save the economy. They had the will to act. Now, they just needed the muscle. While the bankers in New York were plotting in their clubs, a terrifying force was gathering in the mud of Washington, D.C. It was an army, but it didn't belong to the government. In the summer of 1932, thousands of World War I veterans descended on the Capitol. They were known as the Bonus Army. The government had promised these men a cash bonus for their service in the trenches of France. But there was a catch. They wouldn't get the money until 1945. These men couldn't wait 13 years. They were starving now. They had no jobs. They had lost their homes. So, they marched to Washington to demand their money early. They built a massive shantytown on the Anacostia Flats, just across the river from the Capitol Dome. It was a scene from a nightmare. Over 20,000 men lived in huts made of old crates, eggshells, and newspapers. The camp smelled of smoke, sweat, and open latrines. It was a city of ghost men who had been heroes a decade ago, now living like rats in the shadow of the White House. To the politicians, this camp was a humanitarian crisis. But to the plotters on Wall Street, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like an opportunity. Gerald McGuire and his bosses realized that this wasn't just a mob. It was a dormant military force. These men were trained soldiers. They knew how to march, how to shoot, and how to follow orders. More importantly, they were furious. They felt betrayed by the democracy they had fought to save. The bankers realized that the U.S. Army was small and scattered across the country. But right here in the Capitol, there was a force of 20,000 desperate men who would do anything for a paycheck. If someone could organize them, arm them, and pay them, they wouldn't just be protesters. They would be a shock troops capable of seizing the government in a single afternoon. The plotters knew that an angry mob without a leader is just a riot. But an angry mob with a general is a revolution. Gerald McGuire and his backers understood that they couldn't lead the Bonus Army themselves. If a banker in a silk suit stood on a crate and told starving veterans to overthrow the government, he would be lynched. The soldiers hated Wall Street. They blamed the rich for the depression. The bankers needed a mask. They needed a man who smelled like gunpowder, not expensive cologne. They needed a hero the soldiers trusted implicitly. They looked at the list of American generals. Douglas MacArthur was out. He was the one who had burned the veterans' camps on orders from the previous president. The soldiers hated him, but Smedley Butler was different. During the darkest days of the Bonus Army encampment, Butler had visited the mudflats. He walked among the men without bodyguards. He ate their thin soup. He told them they were the only people in America who had kept their promise to the country. To the veterans, Butler was a god. The bankers devised a cynical plan. They would use Butler as the bait. They believed that if Smedley Butler got on a white horse and gave the order, 1 million men would follow him blindly. The plan was terrifyingly simple. The plotters would provide the money to arm and feed the veterans. Butler would provide the voice. They would march these 500,000 men into Washington, D.C. under the guise of protecting the Constitution. Once the city was surrounded, it wouldn't matter what the voters wanted. It wouldn't matter what the laws said. Physical force would dictate the outcome. The bankers calculated that they could turn the anger of the poor into a weapon for the rich, using the most honest man in the military to lead the ultimate betrayal. The bankers had the money, and they had the soldiers, but they were missing one thing: a blueprint. They knew they wanted to get rid of Roosevelt, but they didn't know exactly what to replace him with. A traditional military coup looked too violent. They wanted something that looked modern, efficient, and legal. So, they sent their bagman, Gerald McGuire, on a shopping trip. In late 1933, McGuire boarded a steamship for Europe. He wasn't going for a vacation. He was going to study dictators. Europe in the 1930s was a laboratory of fascism. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had seized power. The American bankers looked at these countries and didn't see tyranny. They saw stability. They saw places where labor unions were crushed and profits were protected. McGuire traveled first to Italy. He watched how Mussolini operated. He saw the black shirts, paramilitary groups of veterans who intimidated the opposition and enforced the leader's will. He was impressed. Then he went to France. There, he found exactly what he was looking for. He studied a group called the Croix de Feu Cross of Fire. This was an organization of French war veterans who marched in the streets demanding a stronger government. They were disciplined, fierce, and completely loyal to their leaders. Maguire realized this was the perfect model for America. The plotters didn't need the U.S. Army. They needed an American version of the Croix de Feu. When Maguire returned to the United States, he rushed to meet Smedley Butler in a hotel room in Philadelphia. He was bursting with excitement. He told the general that he had found the answer. They would create a new organization called the League to support the Constitution. It would sound patriotic. It would claim to protect the flag, but its real purpose was to become a superorganization that answered only to the bankers. Maguire laid out the endgame. He told Smedley Butler that they had realized a traditional coup wouldn't work in America. They couldn't just march into the White House and arrest the president. That would look like a revolution, and the public would fight back. Instead, they planned to do something much more subtle. They planned to kick the president upstairs. Maguire explained that the new superorganization of veterans would march on Washington and create a state of national emergency. Under this pressure, they would force FDR to create a new cabinet position called the Secretary of General Affairs. On paper, this person would just be an assistant to the president to help manage the economic crisis. In reality, this secretary would hold all the power. He would control the budget, the military, and the laws. Maguire told Butler that FDR would remain president, but he would be stripped of all authority. He would be a figurehead, like the King of Italy or the President of France, someone who waved at crowds and cut ribbons but made no decisions. The real ruler of the United States would be the Secretary of General Affairs. It was a terrifyingly clever plan. It allowed the plotters to destroy American democracy while pretending to save it. They wouldn't have to rewrite the Constitution. They would just bypass it. And then Maguire dropped the final piece of the puzzle. He looked at Smedley Butler and told him that he was the man chosen to be this secretary. The bankers wanted Butler to ride into Washington on a white horse, leading the army of veterans, and demand that FDR hand over the keys to the country. They believed that Butler was the only man in America popular enough to make the dictatorship look like patriotism. Smedley Butler sat across from Gerald Maguire and realized he was trapped. If he said no and kicked Maguire out, the plot wouldn't stop. The bankers would simply find another general, someone less honest, someone who wanted the power. The coup would happen, and Butler would be watching from his porch while democracy died. He realized he had only one option. He had to become a spy. Butler leaned back in his chair and forced a smile. He told Maguire, "Gary, this sounds like a hell of a plan, but I am not going to stick my neck out unless I know we have the heavy artillery behind us. An army costs money. I need to know who is writing the checks." It was a dangerous bluff. If Maguire sensed hesitation, he might vanish. But Maguire was arrogant. He believed that every man had a price, and he thought Butler was finally negotiating his fee. Maguire lowered his guard. He started to name names. He told Butler that the money wasn't coming from a few random investors. It was coming from the titans of American industry. He named Grayson Murphy, a director of massive corporations like Goodyear and Bethlehem Steel. He mentioned Robert Clark, an heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Then he dropped the biggest bombshell. He claimed that the plot was backed by men deep inside the JP Morgan banking empire and the DuPont chemical dynasty. These were the men who owned the steel mills, the munitions factories, and the banks. Maguire bragged that they had already raised $3 million in cash to start the operation, with $30 million more in reserve. Butler kept his face stone cold, memorizing every name. Inside, he was reeling. He realized this wasn't just a few rogue traders. This was a conspiracy that reached the very top of the American pyramid. He told Maguire he was in, shook his hand, and walked out of the room. He didn't go to the bank. He went straight to his typewriter to write down everything he had heard before he was gone. Smedley Butler sat in his farmhouse with a list of names that could tear the country apart, but he knew that a list wasn't enough. In a court of law, the bankers would just deny it. They would say Maguire was a low-level liar making things up. Butler needed a second witness. He needed one of the millionaires to confirm the plot to his face. The opportunity came a few weeks later. Gerald Maguire arranged a meeting between Butler and Robert Sterling Clark, the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Clark was one of the wealthy backers Maguire had named. When Clark arrived, he didn't mince words. He was arrogant and direct. He told Butler that he was willing to spend half of his $30 million fortune to save the United States from Roosevelt. He urged Butler to make the speech at the American Legion convention. He even tried to bribe the general again, offering to pay for his children's mortgage. For Butler, this was the final nail in the coffin. It proved that Maguire wasn't lying. The money was real, the backers were real, and they were deadly serious. Butler realized the clock was ticking. The American Legion convention was approaching. If he didn't act soon, the plotters might realize he was stalling and find a new leader. He couldn't wait any longer. He reached out to a friend in Washington who worked for the House of Representatives. He told him he had a story that was too hot to handle over the phone. In November 1934, General Smedley Butler packed a small suitcase and boarded a train to Washington, D.C. He wasn't carrying a gun, but he was carrying a weapon far more dangerous to the Wall Street elite. He was carrying his testimony. He was about to walk into a closed room and accuse the richest men in America of high treason. On November 20, 1934, Smedley Butler walked into a secret room in the House Office building. He was facing the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, a special group of congressmen investigating foreign propaganda. There were no cameras, there was no audience, just a few politicians and a stenographer. Butler sat down and unleashed the hurricane. He testified for 2 hours. He didn't hold anything back. He told them about the men in the limousine, the wad of cash, and the trip to Europe. He explained the plan to raise an army of 500,000 veterans and the plot to force FDR to resign. Most importantly, he named the names. He put the leaders of the JP Morgan empire and the DuPont family on the official record, accusing them of planning to overthrow the United States government. The congressmen were stunned. They were hearing that the pillars of American capitalism were traitors. They immediately ordered investigators to verify the claims and subpoenaed Gerald Mack. But the moment the story leaked to the press the next morning, the counterattack began. It was swift and brutal. The most powerful newspapers in the country, owned by the very class of people Butler was accusing, turned on him instantly. The New York Times ran a front-page headline calling the plot a gigantic hoax. Time magazine mocked Butler, painting him as a senile old soldier who was imagining things. The bankers issued calm, polite denials, laughing off the accusations as fantasy. For a few weeks it looked like the cover-up was going to work. Smedley Butler was being destroyed in the court of public opinion. He sat in his home, watching his reputation burn, while the men he accused toasted their success in New York. They thought they had crushed the whistleblower. But they had forgotten one thing. Gerald McIntyre was a hoarder. When the federal investigators kicked down McIntyre's door, they didn't just find a bond salesman. They found the receipts. While the newspapers were busy calling General Butler crazy, federal investigators were quietly doing their job. They raided Gerald McIntyre's office and seized his personal files. Inside his suitcases, they found the smoking gun. They discovered a series of letters McIntyre had written from Europe to his wealthy bosses in New York. The letters were damning. They described the fascist organizations in Italy and France in exact detail. They discussed how the Croix de Feu operated and how a similar organization could be built in America. The letters confirmed every single detail Smedley Butler had testified to. They proved he wasn't imagining things. He was accurately reporting a plan that was already in motion. The committee dragged Gerald McIntyre back to the witness stand. This time, the arrogance was gone. Under oath, McIntyre started to sweat. He tried to claim he was just a tourist in Europe. But when the congressman pulled out his own letters and read them aloud, his story fell apart. He could unexplain why a simple bond salesman was studying paramilitary tactics and reporting back to Wall Street millionaires. The mood in the hearing room shifted instantly. The politicians realized they weren't dealing with a hoax. They were staring at a conspiracy that had left a paper trail. On February 15, 1935, the committee released their final report to the public. It was a bombshell. The report stated clearly, in the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. It was a total vindication for Smedley Butler. The United States Congress had officially confirmed that Wall Street interests had plotted to overthrow the government. The evidence was undeniable. The witnesses had confessed. The crime was proven. Now, the American public waited for the arrests. They expected the FBI to march into the offices of JP Morgan and start handcuffing billionaires. But they were about to learn that in Washington, proving a crime is very different from punishing it. The congressional report proved the plot was real. But then, something strange happened. The investigation simply stopped. When the final version of the report was printed for the public, it was significantly lighter than the testimony given behind closed doors. The most dangerous names, the titans of the JP Morgan empire and the DuPont family, had been quietly removed. The text was redacted. The Department of Justice, which should have launched the biggest treason trial in American history, did absolutely nothing. There were no indictments. No police cars rolled up to the mansions in New York. Gerald McIntyre, the man caught with the incriminating letters, wasn't even charged with perjury. Historians believe that the lack of arrests wasn't an accident. It was a cold, calculated political deal. President Roosevelt was sitting in the White House, looking at a fragile economy. He knew the names of the men who tried to take his job, but he also knew that these men owned the banks, the factories, and the bond market. If he arrested the richest men in America, Wall Street would panic. The stock market would crash again. The Great Depression, which was just starting to ease, would return with a vengeance. FDR faced an impossible choice. He could have justice, or he could have an economy. He couldn't have both. It appears he made a silent trade. He allowed the conspirators to walk free, provided they backed down and stopped funding the opposition to his New Deal. The business plot was swept under the rug. The billionaires returned to their boardrooms, shaken but safe. They stopped trying to overthrow the government, and in exchange, the government pretended the coup never happened. The curtain was pulled shut, and the American public was left to wonder why the crime of the century had 0 prisoners. General Smedley Butler did not fade away into a quiet retirement. The betrayal by the government he had served for 33 years lit a fire inside him. He realized that stopping the coup wasn't enough. He had to expose the entire system that made the coup possible. He spent the final years of his life on a relentless crusade. He traveled the country in an old car, speaking to veterans in packed halls. He didn't speak about glory or medals. He spoke about the cold, hard business of killing. In 1935, he published a short, explosive book titled War is a Racket. It remains one of the most famous anti-war manifestos ever written. In it, Butler stripped away the patriotic flags and the marching bands to reveal the profit machine underneath. He told the soldiers that they were not heroes defending freedom, they were employees defending bank accounts. He famously wrote, "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." He warned the American public that the next war was coming, and that it would be manufactured by the same men who had tried to buy him, but he never lived to see it. Smedley Butler died in the summer of 1940, just before the world plunged into World War II. Today, the business plot is missing from most history books. It is treated like a strange footnote, an embarrassing moment that everyone wants to forget. But historians look back at 1933 and realize how razor-thin the margin was. The plotters had everything they needed. They had the millions of dollars. They had the weapons. They had the anger of the veterans. The only thing they were missing was the leader. If they had walked onto the porch of a different general, a man with more ambition and less honor, the United States could have easily become a fascist dictatorship. Allied with Nazi Germany, Smedley Butler is remembered as a hero because he fought for his country twice. The first time he fought with a gun to protect its borders. The second time he fought with the truth to protect its soul. He proved that the most dangerous enemies of democracy aren't always foreign armies. Sometimes, they are the men in the limousines who think they can buy it.